We continue our story this week, the story of God's people-making process across the 66 books of the Bible, Old and New Testaments. We continue our story today by looking together at the books of Joshua and Judges. You recall that in 1260 BC, Moses led the people of Israel, the Hebrew people, out of bondage in Egypt into the Sinai wilderness. And it was there in the Sinai wilderness that the people began being formed as a true nation of tribes together. God gives them the law, including the Ten Commandments, of course, and also gives them some worship practices and a traveling sanctuary called the tabernacle. And it's with the law and the tabernacle and the covenant of circumcision that the people interrelate with God and communicate with God during these 40 years of wandering in the Sinai wilderness. Joshua, the book of Joshua, brings us to the approximate date of 1220 BC. In 1220 BC, Moses dies, and a new leader is selected. His name is Joshua. We met Joshua as one of the 12 spies who went to spy on Canaan to see whether or not the Hebrew people could take the land. You remember when the spies returned back they gave a bad report saying, oh, they're giants and we're like grasshoppers, except for two courageous spies, Joshua and Caleb. So we know something about the character and mettle of Joshua even before he becomes the key chief leader of the Hebrew people. But in 1220 BC, it's Joshua who leads the people across the Jordan River and into the land of Canaan, their promised land, a land that God had sworn to Abraham and to Abraham's offspring would be theirs. And we read about the first battle, the Battle of Jericho, which was a kind of a strange fight because the Hebrew people didn't use their swords, they used trumpets. They marched around the city and blew the trumpet and the walls came tumbling down. The story of God saving Rahab the harlot, the lone survivor apparently of Jericho, is one of the very interesting stories of this time period, a story about God's grace offered even to one person who accepts God's offer to go God's way. The book of Joshua is about the conquest of Canaan, and the book of Judges is about the settlement of the Promised Land. These two books cover a period of approximately 200 years in the history of the people of Israel. Joshua brings the people across the Jordan. They begin to wage war against inhabitants and against the city-states that are present there in Canaan. God has judged the inhabitants and God has favored the Hebrews. We have to come to terms with this sort of tragic aspect of providence as we read through these stories. But one thing is very clear and consistent throughout the entire Bible, that God's people are to be different, set apart for God's purposes, worshiping only one God and being sure and careful not to let the sinful practices surrounding them influence their lives or change who God has called them to be. Look for that theme in both Joshua and Judges. After Joshua's leadership, the people are led by charismatic leaders called judges. When we read about the judges, people like Deborah and Gideon and Samson and others, don't think of them as judges like we think of judges today. These are not people who wore black robes and sat behind a bench and judged cases, although we know that one of the judges probably did judge cases, and that was the judge Deborah. Evidently she was respected and wise enough that people did bring their disputes occasionally to Deborah so she could make decisions for them. But judges primarily played the function of deliverers. That's a good definition for a judge, a deliverer. Someone, a leader who God raises in a time of national crisis to bring the people through their difficulty and their crisis. Most of the judges were warriors. They helped Israel find courage and strength, and often led the people at with great odds against them, against armies, the armies of the Canaanites, the armies of the Philistines. And so one interesting question that we have to ask ourselves as we read through this material and read about all the different judges that God used is, what kind of people does God use today? Surely as you read the stories about the judges, they were very interesting folks, very different from one another. And yet God was able to use each one of them for a particular time in Israel's history. How might God be calling you to give leadership in this particular time, this day and age? Leadership to your family, leadership to your church, leadership for your community or business. One of the questions we can all ask ourselves is, how might God choose for us to be leaders in our time? And what kind of leaders do we want to follow? And how can we assure faithful leadership among those who would go before us? Those are good questions to ask. So I hope you'll enjoy reading from Joshua and Judges, this period of about 200 years, from 1220 BC until 1020 BC. Next week we're going to be reading about the first king anointed in Israel, King Saul. I'll look forward to talking more with you then.